Hey everybody, and welcome to the Imaginary Podcast, the podcast that doesn't actually exist. Today, I'm with art historian Grace Baker, and she's going to tell us, what are you going to tell us about today, Grace?
I'm going to tell you about the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, which is a book of hours. Are you excited?
I'm very excited.
Any questions before we start?
Yeah, what is a book of hours?
Oh, okay. So a book of hours is a type of devotional text that was popular in the Middle Ages, especially for women. And it's exactly how it sounds, really. It's a book that's meant to aid the reader with their prayers at different hours of the day. The book contains cycles, that's known as hours, that are to be read at each canonical hour. These cycles include things like the hours of the Virgin, the hour of the Cross, the hours of the Holy Spirit, the office of the dead, among others. And they were extremely customizable and could be made for both extremely wealthy patrons and for upper middle class merchants. Any other questions?
No, all of that makes sense, and these books sound really useful.
Yeah, they were. It was like the Bible of yesteryear, right? Bibles were ginormous. To be able to print that many sheets on thick vellum parchment, it was impossible to even be able to really move much. So a book of hours was something for the everyday person to use in their communication with God.
Okay, so tell me more about this Hours of Mary of Burgundy. What makes it different than other books of hours?
Okay, so the Hours of Mary of Burgundy was created about 1477, and it features 187 folios that are each sumptuously decorated and 20 full-page miniatures. One image in particular has really delighted and intrigued scholars for decades, especially considering its kind of self-referential nature. And that's the frontispiece featuring Mary of Burgundy praying in front of a window through which a scene of the Virgin unfolds. But despite its relative notoriety, very little scholarship has actually been written about the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, and none has really focused on the theological and spiritual applications regarding both the user and the larger cultural context of kind of this 15th century Burgundian court kind of devotion.
So you're concerned with the use of this book of hours, but you also just described what a book of hours was. So don't we know that this image was just used for prayer?
Well, okay, yeah. On the surface, right, this was used for prayer. So that's like surface level 1. Yes, we know it's prayer, but I want to get into more detail than that. The second level is that us as modern readers, when we have pictures in books, we have like a section of text and then a image that directly correlates or kind of is, the text is a description of what the image should look like, right? But that's not necessarily the case here, especially for frontispieces and in other contexts in medieval books and books of hours. So this is a frontispiece image, which means it doesn't exactly correlate to the text. There's not like a Bible story that a frontispiece like this would represent, right?
Right.
Okay, and then the third level is, let's look at a different frontispiece from a different book of hours to try to illustrate my point. So if you look at a more standardized image, which is the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, you can really see how different these two images look, right? This image that we see now, the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, is much more standardized, much more like something you would see at the opening of a book of hours. It has kind of the supplicant in front of the Virgin with a lot of like filigree, and it looks not that different from the page across from it, right? But when we look at the Hours of Mary of Burgundy's frontispiece, we are confronted with a lot of questions, like, that doesn't look like the other one, and that's my question, is why? This inner scene with the Virgin and Child kind of looks like the scene taking place in the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, but it also doesn't, right? What's going on with this kind of window motif, this kind of trick of the eye, the illusionism of it? And whenever I look at any images, I always wonder, what was their use? How is this image practical? Especially when we're looking at something like a Book of Hours that, like I said, was very practical, right? Somebody used this day after day. And so an image like this is very unique, and I want to know exactly how it was used in that context, given all of these things I just said, given the differences, given that it doesn't correspond exactly one-to-one with the text. And so that's what I'm really trying to get at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Awesome. So at this point, I think it would be helpful to kind of describe what we're looking at, and then I'll get into kind of what other people have said about this image so far. Okay? All right. So this image, like I said, is the frontispiece. It's the first kind of full-page miniature that we get right after the calendar. And it appears on folio 14V in the manuscript. And the image is traditionally titled Mary of Burgundy at Prayer. Like I said, it features a woman, which we can assume to be Mary of Burgundy, sitting before a window in contemporary dress. In her lap is a small dog, and she holds a book that is protected by a green cloth. This book is a Book of Hours, and we can identify it by the large O that's on it. And that large O begins Marian prayers, which are the beginnings of Book of Hours. So either the O for O Intermirata or the O for Obscuro Te, it doesn't matter. We know that this book that she's holding is a Book of Hours. In the windowsill is a necklace embedded with pearls and other precious stones on a gold chain, as well as a vase of irises and a few carnation buds. The irises draw the eye upward around the frame and into the scene taking place through the window. Outside the window, or kind of inside at the same time, is a large chapel with tall vaulted ceilings, arcades, and portals. And in the center of the chapel, before the altar, sits the Virgin Mary with the infant Christ in her lap. Several figures surround the Virgin and Child in veneration. Although their identification has been debated, I believe that the most plausible reading is that of Mary of Burgundy appearing again before the Virgin this time in an opulent gold and blue brocade gown. And her entourage sits behind her. Opposite her is a male, who some scholars identify as a priest, but others argue is actually Maximilian, who was Mary of Burgundy's husband, appearing in priestly garb. For the present discussion, either identification is really satisfactory. The burning question, though, that kind of permeates this miniature is simple. Why does Mary of Burgundy appear twice? Both of which are in an image that the real Mary would see in the very prayer book that she holds. Do you have any questions about the image itself?
I think I'm ready to get into the thick of it.
Okay. So let's talk about for a moment what's already been written about these images. Apart from brief mentions in textbooks about the Northern Renaissance, surprisingly little in-depth scholarship has actually been written about the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, especially given its extravagance and how notorious this image is. Like, in every Northern Renaissance or even many art history textbooks, they refer to this image and they're like, oh my gosh, look how crazy self-referential it is. This is such an opulent image. It represents Burgundian art and courts and books of hours, and it's exemplary of all these things and all of these technologies and everything, but nobody goes in depth, which is just crazy to me. Otto Pacht and Eric Inglis were both kind of earlier scholars on this book that have written overviews of the contents of the hours, but they haven't given really deep iconographic or contextual analyses. They each give a paragraph or two, maybe a page, dedicated to this frontispiece image. Susan Groag Bell was the first to identify the figure in the background of the frontispiece as a secondary portrait of Mary of Burgundy, while Erica O'Brien and others have argued that the identification of the figure in the back is either Isabella of Bourbon or Margaret of York.
Are Isabella in Bourbon and Margaret of York, related to Mary of Burgundy? Why would they think that that's them in the back?
Right, that's a great question. So, Isabella of Bourbon was Mary of Burgundy's mother, who died when Mary was still quite young. And so the author argues that this Isabella of Bourbon figure is here to kind of guide Mary in her prayers. But I don't really agree with the identification. A lot of it boils down to the face shapes being different, when that woman in the background, her face is like smaller than the size of my pinky nail. Like, it's impossible to say whether or not her face features are that different than the person in the foreground. Like, it's a very tenuous kind of identification. And it also really relies on the fact that Mary of Burgundy fought to keep her mother's image alive, like, while she was alive. But there's no reason why something that's a public display needs to translate into something that's a private devotion. Margaret of York is the woman who commissioned this book for Mary of Burgundy. Oh, okay. And so it's kind of a similar thing, like, I'm here to guide you in your prayers. But Margaret of York owned a lot of books, commissioned a lot of books and a lot of artworks. And she never depicts herself in this way, in these colors. It's very standardized how she depicts herself, and it doesn't line up. So I'm not satisfied with either of those identifications.
Okay.
Other scholars like Brett Rothstein and Sherry Lindquist have both written about the marginalia and how it impacts our readings of the hours, which is interesting and meaningful, but still doesn't get really in depth to this image. No scholars have done an incomplete, in-depth analysis of these full-page miniatures and how this image in particular was meant to be read and used. And that, like I said, is my exact goal. Like, what was the use?
So why has so little been written about this Book of Hours? Is it a relatively new piece of studying this type of art? Or is this just a very obscure book? Or, like, is this just something you're really into and nobody else is?
So that's the super interesting thing. When I was first kind of conceptualizing that I wanted to work on this project, I was thinking I'm going to have to put myself into this large narrative. I'm going to have to really assert what I think this is among a sea of other interpretations. And as I went looking for these other interpretations to kind of get my groundwork, nobody's talked about it, which is just mind-blowing to me. Because, like I said, there are brief mentions in all kinds of different textbooks. Northern Renaissance textbooks, books about books of hours, books about Burgundian books of hours, books about art history, just like introduction to art history. Everybody knows about this image. It's notorious because it's so intriguing. And yet, nobody's written about it. So that's why I'm here, I guess.
It's just absurd.
I know. It's crazy to me. Like, I cannot explain to you how blown away I was where I was doing search after search after search, and I'm getting nothing back. I was just like, am I not searching the right places? Wow. And it turns out I was a little bit not searching the right places. I did find some things since then. So let's get into some context, kind of where and when this image was created, right? So the courts of Burgundy reached kind of the apex of their wealth and prestige during the time of Philip the Good, who reigned from 1416 to 1467. And his reign saw Burgundian expansion, administrative reform, and especially in excess of the patronage of the arts. So it's a very rich, bustling, innovative, cultural and artistic scene, right? And when Philip the Good dies, and then his son Charles the Bold dies very quickly thereafter, Mary of Burgundy inherits these kind of disparate lands who are at the same time very wealthy. She was one of the most powerful women of her time and was definitively the richest. Wow. And so this book is kind of a testament to that. It was created with her in mind. And as such, like I said, it was innovative. It's representative of a culture. It's so expensive. And it was made for her and to help her in her devotion. So now we need to talk a little bit about the religious practices. So we talked about what books of hours are, but we really need to get into what Christianity was at this time. And to do that, we have to go back a little further and understand a practice called mysticism. So do you know what mysticism is?
When I think of the idea of mysticism, I usually think of it in like a witchcraft sort of way. But like in this, is it like a more superstitious form of Christianity?
That's a general understanding, yes. Something kind of vague, mysterious, witchy. But mysticism, especially in Christianity, actually has a much more precise definition. And I believe that Bernard McGinn, who was a scholar who wrote countless books about the origins, development, rise, and transformation of Christian mysticism, has an excellent definition. And he says that mysticism is a part or element of Christian belief and practice that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the effect of what the mystics themselves have described as a direct and transformative presence of God. It's important to remember that the presence of God is not a goal, but rather a process and a practice that's kind of continuously maintained and engaged with. Some mystics even believed that no direct interaction with the divine was possible in this life, and all of this was preparation for kind of a heavenly encounter with God.
So when I think of the presence of God, I think about my own little bit Pentecostal upbringing. Is this what these people are talking about? Is it the type of presence of God where, he's come down from heaven and you can feel him around you, or is it something that it's a little different than that?
It's kind of like that, actually. So there's mysticism in modern Pentecostal churches.
That's a little spicy.
Yeah, but I mean, every mystic has a different definition, has different interactions with God, even within the same person's writing about the same visionary experience. There's these different ideas of what the presence of God can mean. But basically, kind of all things considered, it's deep contemplation, maybe a vision, a feeling of ecstasy or rapture, kind of a birthing or a marriage and union with God, kind of like even an erotic kind of desire interaction with God. And so this is why McGinn chooses presence as the best all-encompassing word. It's really all of those different things of trying to interact with or get as close to interaction as you can with God. A key thread is that mystical experience usually involves some kind of bodily interaction or feeling.
So why is that not viewed as a goal? And what makes it a practice instead?
Well, many texts and biographies of mystics warn repeatedly against trying to make visions or other experiences happen, because essentially that's somebody trying to make God do something, and that's foolish. You can't expect that or think that God's going to respond nicely to that.
That makes sense.
Instead, these texts emphasize things like humility, prayer, fasting, meditation, concentration, especially the imitation of Christ, sometimes the shunning of the material world, or even the corporeal, like things you see and interact with, things like that. And all of this is meant to kind of purify and prepare oneself for if they encounter the divine, or when they do in the next life. Which, like I said, it could be either way. It could happen in this lifetime or the next, depending on the person.
Who are these mystics?
Another great question. You're just full of great questions.
It's like they're written in front of me.
So mysticism is something that has origins in Judaism before the advent of Christianity. So who exactly these mystics were changes over time. If I just say Paul, will you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know who Paul is.
Okay. Paul has things to say about this renewal of the mind and contemplation of Christ. Some of the early church fathers, such as St. Augustine and Origen, were foundational mystics. The monastic tradition especially produced many great mystics, including women such as Hadwick and Mechthild. An earlier generation of scholars believed that mysticism kind of died out with the rise of universities, with the emphasis on logic and religious studies. But that's not actually true, and we have mystics through the High Middle Ages, Renaissance, Reformation, and even the Counter-Reformation. And like we said, there's still mystical elements of kind of wanting to encounter God in churches today.
So you think that this image has some kind of mystical undertone to it?
Yes, that's my argument. That these images, multiple images in the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, but this one in particular, had a similar purpose to mystical images, which was to offer kind of organizing structures to stimulate and nurture meditation. Mystics saw images as these instruments of soul formation. These images often featured like a Visio Dei, were mnemonic devices, initiated or aided in the reading of a text, and perhaps most importantly, were striking images that left an impact. They moreover helped make something supposedly impossible to imagine, something beyond our understanding, which is God, visible. And overall, these images cultivated the practice of visualization, thus engaging the soul as kind of vinculum mundi, or a link between the earthly and heavenly worlds. We can therefore see that images were not just for simple layfolk who couldn't read, which is what most people assume is the sole function of Christian imagery, but actually is connected to this larger tradition. And yes, I believe that these images have roots in mysticism.
Wait, so you said that mystics are like these church fathers and monastics like Augustine and Origen. That's not Mary of Burgundy. She's a queen.
Well, she's a duchess, but that's true.
Oh, whoops.
That's okay. Mysticism had a huge impact on Christianity. Like I said, it's kind of woven into the fabric of the Bible and what Christianity is. Particularly, it had an impact on a form of Christianity that quickly grew in popularity in the late 14th and 15th centuries, the same time as books of hours developed. This practice was called the Devotio Moderna, and its adherents preached humility, obedience, self-knowledge, compunction, self-surrender, overcoming the world as Christ did, who was the model for true Christians. And this imitation of Christ was one of the most important tenets.
Well, that sounds like some of the things you describe as being mystical.
Exactly. So the point of key difference here is that the Devotio Moderna was not directly concerned with fostering mystical contact with God, but that doesn't mean those mystical elements aren't there. They do kind of adhere to that same process that the mystics adhered to, like I said, and had an aim of achieving what McGinn calls a deep interiority in which the individual will be able to cultivate love of Jesus and attain the peace and freedom of the Spirit that are God's rewards. However, the Devotio Moderna did not exclude the possibility of mystical states or union with God. They merely believed that union and visionary experiences were primarily rewards attained in heaven by these virtuous practices in one's earthly life. So now you can kind of see why I think these things are connected, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
It makes sense that mysticism influenced the Devotio Moderna. And one of the things that's interesting about the Devotio Moderna is it was kind of a response to Catholicism being kind of very distant from the people who practiced it, right? Like, going to church, listen to what they say, take communion once a year, and go home. Right. And people who developed the Devotio Moderna was like, every person should have a deep connection with Christ and with God, and that's what kind of started this. And that's why books of hours even came into existence, is because those adherents needed something to help them. I mean, they can't have a whole Bible, like I said, that's like too big. It doesn't make sense. But by having this book of prayers that they read at the same time every day and focused and, listened to these kinds of practices and adhered to them, they were able to foster this connection with God. And fostering a connection with God is what mysticism is all about.
That's interesting. So it sounds, to make a parallel here, like mysticism is kind of like a pre-printing press Protestantism. In a strange way, not saying that they're, rejecting the Pope and nailing theses on the door, but this idea that we should be close to God in a way deeper than just going to church and praying.
Exactly.
And having our own personal relationship with Him.
Yeah. And here's something that's kind of important to note. We know for a fact that Margaret of York, who commissioned the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, and Mary of Burgundy were aware of these Devotio Moderna texts. Like, we have for a fact these texts were in their libraries, so we know that all of this is connected. Yeah.
That's cool. In their personal libraries.
Yes. Well, cool. Literally, Margaret of York had one of the biggest book collections of her time, and if I'm remembering correctly, she had the largest book collection owned by a woman.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
wow.
Yeah. All of that kind of brings us back to these images, right? We've talked about the context, and now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty of how these images were used. So I argue that the intended use for the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, in this image in particular, was to allow the reader a more personal relationship with the heavenly, as per the Devotio Moderna. And more specifically, these elaborate frontispiece images were intended to help the user achieve spiritual transformation and interact with the divine through visualization. Such visualization was achieved by the tools present and alluded to in the images, namely the doubleness of the body and the insertion of the self into the biblical. This goal and these tools are reflective of how Christian mysticism, especially female mysticism, influenced lay devotional practices. So let's look at this image, Mary of Burgundy at prayer, and ask ourselves, how would this image function? How would it aid Mary in her art of prayer? As I mentioned before, the Devotio Moderna and mysticism wasn't about an end goal, it was a practice followed for one's entire life. And prayer acts similarly. It's a process rather than a completion. These images were meant to be contemplated and looked over and used, as I said, to stimulate and nurture meditation. In examining the marginalia of the hours, Rothstein states that these images, quote, provoke a fundamentally comparative and dynamic sort of manner of viewing that returns constantly to the aims of visualization. And there's no reason why this dynamism and comparativity cannot apply to full-page miniatures. Art historian Jeffrey Hamburger speaks on how meditation is focused on the connection between disparate ideas, including the rational and the irrational, the natural and the supernatural, inner and outer, visible and invisible, idol and similitude. As the portrait of Mary Burgundy sits in the windowsill with a neutral expression, contemplating the book in her hands, her finger marks the passage on which she concentrates, clearly signaling the book is her means of devotion. This Mary embodies the natural, the outer, the visible, the similitude. This Mary in the windowsill.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In the background, through the open window, is another portrait of Mary, gazing not at a book, but upward, worshipping the Virgin and Child. She represents the supernatural, the inner, the invisible, the idol. She represents an ideal of seeing the Virgin appearing before her, the invisible and inner contemplations of the outer portrait in many ways. She may even represent the soul of this windowsill Mary. There is, however, a third Mary of Burgundy to consider here. The real Mary that holds the very book in which this image appears, who physically holds the book and uses her corporeal senses to navigate it.
Oh, there's a third Mary that is Mary.
Yeah, the real person, or whoever's using this book. In this way, the foreground portrait, so the windowsill Mary, functions as both a mirror and a window. Firstly, she's a reflection. She is in the likeness of the real Mary and should, at least theoretically, mirror the actions that the real Mary would be enacting at the moment she sees the image. The windowsill Mary, however, is also idealized, representing the idea of prayer, and in this way it acts as a window, leading the real Mary to a mystical visualization or experience like the one taking place in the background. But as the embodiment of prayer and proper devotion, the windowsill Mary places a reflective expectation on the real Mary, expecting the real Mary to embody all that proper devotion entails.
It's Maryception out here.
It is, it really is. It's this kind of layering effect. Brett Rothstein talks about how some images, such as this one called Young Man at Prayer by Petrus Christus, assigns the task of seeing rather than looking to the viewer. And I found this idea of a painting, like assigning homework to the viewer, as being something that's super interesting and really powerful. And I kind of saw that as being completely applicable to this image. The windowsill Mary kind of assigns homework to the real Mary of Burgundy, saying, hey, you should do this, and you should be making this visualization, like what we see in the background, happen. But as both a window and a mirror, we can see that the image can act as both praise and admonishment. Like, hey, good job, you're doing good, look at you, you look like me, you're doing the good act of prayer, this is awesome. Or like, hey, pay attention, this is what you're supposed to be doing, it should be looking like this, you should be concentrated and trying to make this image happen. And all of this is happening with the image not changing. It's staying static, but doing all of this reflexive work. We can see then, interestingly, it's not the real Mary that's carrying the authority, nor is it really the resplendent virgin and child. Rather, it's the windowsill Mary that holds an almost headache or dizzying amount of power. And it's important to kind of remember here that self-surrender was an important tenet to the Devotio Moderna, and the windowsill Mary is kind of a stepping stone to that. And it's like the real Mary would not totally lose control in this sense, because the power is still metaphorically held by herself, this windowsill Mary. But something I argue for the later images, which unfortunately we don't have time to talk about, is that there's this complete surrender and insertion into these biblical narratives and like a loss of oneself in a very interesting way. So this is kind of a predecessor to that. This scene also represents the present and the future, again, bringing together disparate ideas into one. The Mary in the windowsill should be a reflection of the real Mary in prayer, but her contemplation leads to the future, Mary before the Virgin and Child. Again, the Devotio Moderna taught that for the vast majority of practitioners, union with the divine or visionary experiences were primarily rewards attained in heaven. So the future here could be a heavenly vision or possibly an earthly one, but either way, it's a future event, something that's trying to be induced or prepared for. Taking all this in, we can think of the windowsill Mary as being representative of meditation itself, being a synthesis of all of these different ideas, but embodying all of them nonetheless. She represents that bridge to an alternate reality and an aid in the user's spiritual journey. In essence, she is an image, both the real thing and a representation of it. Both the soul and the image were seen as vinculum mundi, or links between earthly and spiritual worlds.
That's a lot for one image to say, and I'm not saying that I get it better than you do, but I'm wondering, do you think that you're looking into it too far? Like, do we know that Mary of Burgundy would have looked at this image and thought of all those things?
Well, firstly, we can't know anything for sure. This is my interpretation. But I will say, this was meant to be viewed over a long period of time. Quite possibly every day or multiple times a day from the time you receive this Book of Hours until the day you die. So Mary would be exposed to this image. And you know how like the longer you look at something, the more things pop up, or the more times you watch a movie, you get more details that come through? That's exactly what this image is. It's not meant to come into you all at once. It's something that over time you're like, oh, and the book itself is opened to the O Intimorata, which is the prayer I'm about to read. Like, it's that putting together that is really key here. And so, like I said, it's representative of this practice, right? This Devotio Moderna, this mysticism, was meant to be practiced and meant to be kind of ritualized and teased through every day. Moreover, I will say that mental agility was something that was prized as the mark of a true devotee. The ability to tease out meanings from words and images was super important. And that gets back to the point, why have all of these complex relationships and disparate themes in the first place? The idea of bringing together disparate themes is kind of essential to Christianity, like holding Christ as both God and man at the same time. And the ability to bring together disparate themes and understand how they're similar and how they're dissimilar is essential to understanding God. And that's something that's held over from mysticism, right? It's only through the act of reading these images and reading these texts and looking at these things over and over and practicing this every day that these things come together and make sense. The real Mary must reflect that idealized concentration of prayer in hopes to unlock that vision. But that can't happen without a real person to look at and use this book, right? And that is the need for the self-referential frontispiece. This frontispiece establishes the need for meditation, the act of meditation through this visual reminder. This gets back to that idea of admonishment, right? Like, if you're not doing this right, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Keeping in mind that meditation is not a thing, it's a process, we can delve into it a bit further. When humans fell from grace, they lost their understanding of God in a lot of ways. Their corporeal eyes were opened and their spiritual selves kind of got closed off, right? The act of meditation, according to scholars, allows that lapsarian infancy of our souls to begin to progress, for one to develop their mental agility in that set of skills. And the development of those skills, that's kind of nurtured by a book of hours, allows the person to move themselves closer to God in a very real way. It's like taking physical steps towards something, but you're taking spiritual steps instead towards God by reading, by meditating, by praying, etc. Mary of Burgundy's spiritual and mental wit have improved by using this manuscript. Something that's not just of social value in courtly society, but was believed to have real value in the next life, such as the spiritual life in the court of heaven.
Oh, the court of heaven, as in literally what she's looking through the window at.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
So do you see how all these things are kind of coming together?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay, so this image is a picture of Mary looking through a picture at what she should be striving for in her spiritual life and what she will eventually experience someday after her death.
Right. It's very much emphasizing the ritual, right? You need to be able to continually use this in order to get to that, which is what the middle windowsill Mary is representing or getting at, admonishing, praising the real Mary for.
Because it's a literal image of what she should be doing.
Right. It's both a mirror and a window.
Wow, Grace, that was really informative and mind-blowing how meta this one image from the Middle Ages was. I hope you enjoyed your time here.
I did, for sure. I hope you learned something and also understood what I was saying.
I learned so much.
Did you enjoy it, though?
That was really cool.
Isn't it weird to see something so self-referential from something literally from like 600 years ago?
We think of self-referential and we think that's more of like a modern or postmodern idea, but this kind of shatters that, and that's a lot of fun.
For sure.
So, hey, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on this imaginary podcast.
We'll see you next time.